Right, good afternoon everybody and welcome to the Nature Positive Pavilion. We've still got people coming in, but we're going to kick off. We've got quite a bumper panel this afternoon and we're going to be looking at innovative financial solutions and financing nature, but with a strong emphasis on innovation. And we have some examples from all around the world, which is why we have practice what we preach. We have innovated and rearranged the Nature Positive stage so that we can fit all our panelists up here. We have examples from Kazakhstan to Liberia, South Africa to Mexico, and perspectives from the private and public sectors, from civil society and community conservation actors on the ground. So we're really hoping to showcase some very concrete and hopeful and inspiring examples of innovative finance for nature and conservation. But this wouldn't be possible without the collaborative partners on this session. So thank you to UNDP and BirdLife International, Planet Tracker, and the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. My name is Candace Stevens, and I co-chair the IUCN WCPA Sustainable Finance Specialist Group, which is a bit of a mouthful. And I also have the privilege of chairing Africa's Sustainable Finance Coalition. And essentially my role, both at a global level and a regional level, is to support cohesive engagement around finance for nature. So think about it as developing and enhancing a sector for conservation finance, and then amplifying the development of new and innovative financial solutions, which is something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm not sure if any of you who've been wrapped up in the busyness that is COP have had an opportunity to go and visit the virtually immersive display from Nat Geo and Campaign for Nature downstairs. After some of the very intense moments in the negotiations at this COP, I decided to take a time out and head down there. And I loved seeing and being reminded why it is that we are here, being surrounded by jungles and forests, oceans, icescapes, mountains, deserts. And that really brought me back to the point of when we need to innovate and we need to create new finance solutions, it does require an element of hope, and it does require us to remember why it is that we're here and what it is that we're doing all of this for. So with that said, I'm going to call up our panel in a minute who are going to showcase some of those examples. But I want to touch on two key enablers to creating innovative financial solutions. The one is that it requires all hands on deck, all skill sets, all sectors, all stakeholders. It's simply not possible to push the boundaries of the way finance interacts with nature and to create solutions that have tangible flows of finance at their point of impact, the targeted place for conservation actors and activities, without doing it together. If we're going to take typical instruments like tax or bonds or any other finance mechanism and move them, enhance them, retrofit them to be able to address nature needs where they're needed the most, it requires a plethora of skill sets and approaches to problem solve and be able to create those solutions. And the second enabler that I want to touch on before we get into our discussion is the fact that we need a diversified toolbox of finance solutions. Too long, we fought the good green fight without the sufficient financial resources to do so, and we've seen finance come in from very typical funding sources, one revenue or one income stream at a time, and we need to be able to move beyond just the hammer and the nail approach and the traditional approach to financing nature, and look at how do we develop and create and catalyze every possible finance mechanism, instrument, and tool that we could potentially manage collectively. So my challenge to everybody here is you represent a specific sector, you have a specific skill set, you sit with reach to a specific group of stakeholders. How is it that we can be inspired from some of the innovative solutions we're going to hear about today and go back into those sectors with those skill sets and stakeholders and catalyze new finance solutions for nature, and finance solutions that are really targeted in their approach. a specific species, a specific ecosystem, a resilient livelihood, how do we attach the finance we need to the conservation action that's required on the ground? So with that, the showcase of examples we have today look specifically at those issues. So I'm going to welcome up Patricia Purcell, who is the Senior Advisor on Nature, Climate and Energy for the UNDP. Thank you for joining us. Ellison Wright, who is the Senior Environmental Finance Specialist from the World Bank, and also the task team leader on the Wildlife Bond in South Africa, which at home, in my home country of South Africa, we refer fondly to it as the Rhino Bond. I'm going to also welcome up NLN Swaroop, who is the Director of Sustainable Trade Finance and Alternative Distribution for HSBC. Swaroop, thank you for joining us. Come up and find a perch. Then we're going to call on John Willis. John is the Director of Research for Planet Tracker and involved with multiple financial institutions, so we look forward to hearing your perspectives. We've got Sergio Graf, who's the International Coordinator for Climate Action in Jalisco in Mexico. Sergio, thank you so much for joining us. We've then got Vera Veranova, who's the Executive Director for ACBK, the BirdLife Partner in Kazakhstan. Vera, thank you very much. Hop on up. And then last and certainly not least, we have Michael Garbo, who's the Executive Director for the Society for the Conservation of Nature in Liberia. Right, and that's our panel. Right, so everybody's got a seat, and as I said, we really have examples from around the world, which is so exciting. So Ellison, I'm going to start with you. And it would be great to hear about what the World Bank was able to achieve with the Wildlife Bond.
Thank you so much, Candace. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. Let me first thank you for inviting us to be here. It's such a privilege, and really we could hear from any of the colleagues there in this room. It's really fantastic. The Wildlife Bond that we're going to talk about today, it's an effort that actually builds on a lot of important activities that happened years ago. Okay, so there are many, many colleagues, including from the UNDP, from ZSL, Conservation Alpha, and many others who really laid the groundwork with some global environment facility funding, as well as funding from other donors to really make it happen. The World Bank came in at the end of 2019, really beginning of 2020 when COVID was picking up. And that's when we really started to get engaged and try to make this a reality, okay? And as everybody knows, COVID was taking off, everything was changing, and there were a lot of questions about, you know, should we really be doing this now? And the World Bank is focused on poverty reduction and shared prosperity. And we always have to inform and build consensus to try to get investments in biodiversity. And for the World Bank, the big thing is we think it's an important investment, and not just for the, you know, the ecosystems, the nature itself, but, you know, these oftentimes rural livelihoods that are quite far and don't have as many opportunities as otherwise. But it's always a case of trying to get a lot of support and then push it forward. So it's been a long journey, okay, but we had the great benefit of picking up work from a lot of colleagues. And I don't know if Kathleen Fitzgerald is here, but she was also involved with that effort before, and lots of other colleagues as well. So to cut to the chase, okay, how did we make it a reality? First, I have to say it was not easy, okay? It was a long road, and everybody was focused on COVID and not necessarily on other efforts. But, you know, we were able to get consensus, and usually our initial discussion will go, no, now is not the right time. No, we can't look at that. But, you know, once we explain what we were trying to do and how to go about it, then we always brought, you know, additional support, and we brought in additional guidance that made it a reality. So there were lots of twists and turns along the way, but ultimately there are four things that really were essential to make it happen. The first one was a very generous grant from the Global Environment Facility. So you need an outcome payer for this particular structure that can make it happen, okay? So the Jeff, they have what's called a non-grant instrument, and Avro and her team there, they do a great job. And our good colleague there, who unfortunately passed away early this year, Gustavo Fonseca, he was a champion of this effort. But basically, that outcome payer was essential. So once we, started engaging, we had submitted application, that made it happen. The second one is, you needed to really get the investors to get excited, and in this case, take on risk for a biodiversity outcome. You can like biodiversity, you can want to do something, but unless you understand it, you're not going to put your money to work, and certainly not your client's money to work on something that you can't model and stand behind. So I think that took a lot of education, a lot of questions, a lot of engagement to make that happen. The third thing was, without the incredible work of the two agencies who really have the mandate for managing these beautiful protected areas and doing all the work, which are the sand parks as well as the Eastern Cape Authority there, ECPTA, they're the ones who really have the great track record and who were selected by the teams before the bank got involved, okay? Out of a universe of about 130 different sites that could have been participating in this, they were the two. And a good portion of that is their incredible track record for growing rhinos, black rhinos specifically, as well as their management capacity and other important work they have on their way. And the final piece, and this is where the World Bank comes in, the World Bank issues around $50 to $60 billion of bonds every year, and that's to support sustainable development goals initiatives globally. And, so it has that capital markets expertise and over 70 years of track record of doing that. What we had not done, and this is our colleagues in Treasury, they hadn't issued a particular bond that was tied to a biodiversity outcome and, tied to a specific project. So in this case, by working together and bringing the operational side of the bank where I sit, I'm in the environment department, and then the Treasury that has expertise on the capital market side, and then we were able to marry and really get full approval up the chain all the way to the president to make this happen. And ultimately, what the result is, it's a $150 million bond, okay, that was issued. And if you recall kind of where interest rates have been the last 2 or 3 years, it's been a real journey. And in that process, we were considering issuing a RAND issuance, okay, just because the interest rates were so much higher. And then eventually, but again, it was a $150 million bond, and it generates around $10.5 million at the time of the issuance to these two important sites. That's around 152 million Rand. And that is the foregone coupon payments from the investors who, again, these are really vanguard investors that are at the forefront and taking on a very large size. $150 million is not something that's small and certainly nothing that has been done before. And their potential return is tied to, growth of this black rhino population. So, that is happening now. The important thing about this instrument, and I think this is what excited a lot of my senior management there, was it does not add debt to the sovereign, okay? So this is, as Candace was mentioning, a large potential diverse portfolio of tools. This is one, and in this particular one, it does not add debt to the sovereign. But it is very significant in additional funding to these two parks that are essential for this important, critically endangered species. So the last point that I will mention is that it relies on very strong and robust M&E. Okay, so we require this for the investors, which will be the payout. And Conservation Alpha, the colleagues there, as well as ZSL, they have an important role. So ultimately, in 5 years' time, and now it's around a little over 4 years, the investors, they may get a potential premium on their investment, okay, compared to a 5-year plain vanilla World Bank bond, and it's around a 50 basis point difference. But basically, if there's the highest growth rate, which is above 4% growth, okay, they'll get that maximum payout, which is 13.76 million, okay? And again, if there's no growth, all of that money goes back to the GEF. So the important thing is that the risk of outcomes is being transferred from the donors, and GEF usually does that, to the investors, and they were able to weigh out their potential returns and risks and put this in their portfolio. And the final word that I would say is that talking to one of the largest investors we had in the bond about a week ago, he mentioned how with the big turmoil in the markets last couple of months, in September, this was the best performing bond he had in his portfolio. which is, pretty crazy, because if you look at all of the different diversified instruments out there and what can be done, this is an important piece. So I think we're just understanding and scratching the surface of what's possible from the financial instruments that are already out there, and we just need to really continue to replicate and scale, and that's what we're trying to do. So thank you.
Ellison, thank you so much. I think it's a really fantastic example of how many different role players and how many different skill sets needed to come together to make something like this work, and then to be able to create this additional finance in South Africa for key protected areas and for key species, so that we see this new flow of finance coming in right at its targeted, most impactful point. So thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to move on to Sergio, and if you could just share some of the innovation that's coming out of Mexico.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and to be here with you. Well, I will read because to be in time, and my English is not really good, but I will try. Well, the state of Jalisco is one of the most populous and economically thriving states in Mexico, and also one of the most biodiverse, with 4.5 million hectares of forest covering more than 50% of the state. The health of our biodiversity, economy, and citizens go hand in hand, and biodiversity offers enormous value to the economy and society of Jalisco. On the one hand, approximately 11% of services under protection, and we have an objective in 2030 to achieve the 30% to be in the level of new global agreement. On the other hand, Jalisco developed a comprehensive strategy for biodiversity and climate change conservation, which incorporates two specific strategies: the strategy for the integration of biodiversity in the productive sectors and the RED Plus state strategy, as well as specific programs such as natural protected areas, wildfire management, and for sustainable development. This institutional framework has allowed us to implement a transversality agenda with the agriculture and agro-industrial sector to stop the main drivers of deforestation and degradation of the biodiversity. This how promote deforestation-free production chains working with the private sector. One of them is the tequila agave value chain that now we achieved that, to create a very innovative mechanisms of the denomination origin product, like is tequila, to assure that any plantation of agave will coming from deforested areas. And we will arrive in 2026 that everything, all bottles of tequila in the world will have an non-deforestation certificate. That will be very important because the tequila is growing the demand globally. To have this strategy to integrate the productive sectors, we need to have a very comprehensive strategy of financial support. And that's the reason that we have an agreement with UNDP to develop Biofin. It's a very important agenda that permits us to analyze the gap of financial in biodiversity. And Biofin helped map available financial mechanism in Jalisco and begin implementing biodiversity finance solution to achieve our commitments. One solution was the link the main public funds and create common objectives, indicators, and goals aligned to the SDGs. And Biofin also helped structure and align ministry budgets by detailing current biodiversity investment amount and to identify the specific areas in which they are invested. Thanks to this work, the 4 funds that the state have, Entrepreneurship Fund, Environmental Fund, Agriculture Fund, and Forest Development Fund, are now well aligned. Each program complements the other, that means that the financial activities related to each specific area while working toward the same common goal. An excellent example of this new alignment is the program for conversion to sustainable livestock AIM2, Agriculture Fund financing protein banks, the Forestry Fund financing tree nurseries, and the Environmental Fund financing implementation of a new sustainable practices. Other examples for convergence include the Entrepreneurship Fund providing livestock producer access to credits, financial cooperatives, and microfinance organizations developing initiatives to access credit. The Agriculture Fund financed subsidies related to sustainable activities, and especially for forest management program, and the Environmental Fund assisting with forestry carbon bonds. Results includes the Entrepreneurship Fund, Fund's Green Finance Program, which provide credits for green, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and the budgetary alignment of environmental areas within the Gender Equality and Social Assistance Ministries. Another strategy plan in partnership with UNDP Biofin is the ongoing establishment of a Green Investment Office in the Ministry of Finance to create investment strategy to achieve state priorities and mechanisms to align budgets. This new office will propose the most efficient financial instrument to channel resources such as public-private partnership, matching funds, issuance of thematic bonds, hybrid and fiscal mechanisms, task offsets, and sustainable practices incentives will ensure biodiversity positive impacts. The Jalisco Bioeconomy Acceleration Fund seeks to generate a hybrid investment mechanism for small business that use and conserve biodiversity. And this fund is a combination of 2 state funds and 1 national fund to grant investment with groups that we want to consolidate as sustainable companies, little companies, the small companies, as well as with the allocation of credits for consolidated companies that require a boost in their production or marketing system. All of these initiatives focused on environmental investment will translate into clear benefits for the population, such as green infrastructure, cities, reduction in pollution, and other solutions. In conclusion, I think biodiversity priorities are now being addressed through resource mobilization and budgetary efficiency, which have reduced the biodiversity finance gap in Jalisco. The government will continue to work closely with international organizations like Biofan, ministries, and local community groups to close the gap and continue our leadership for the fulfillment of Mexico international biodiversity commitments.
Sergio, thank you so much. It's incredible to hear about how much is going on in one district in Mexico. And I think your example about certification for tequila is great to hear. I just have to share a little tidbit here. So in some of the negotiations yesterday, one of the delegates from Mexico promised other delegates some tequila if they could just make some concessions and get rid of some brackets. So I can understand why there's an increase in demand for sustainable tequila around the world. I'm going to move on to John now, and it would be fantastic to hear a little bit more from Planet Tracker. You're involved with so many different financial institutions and investigating exciting blue bonds and others. So, John, if you can share a little around that innovation, it would be great.
Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Candice. And I know you want me to run to time because you haven't put any cushions on these benches, so you want us off quickly.
It's very strategic.
That's right. So I used to work for one of the investment banks, which is why I'm not wearing a tie, because I'm pretending that I'm not financial now. But Planet Tracker is very much focused on the financial community, and we're a mixture of environmental experts and people from the financial community. So Candice mentioned blue bond, and you'll say, well, I've heard lots about blue bonds before. That's fair enough. And what we've been looking at is a blue recovery bond. The reason that we've been proposing this is that we think that the markets, financial markets, are innovating at quite a rate. And Candice, thank you for putting this together, because if there's one thing you don't need to worry about from financial markets is innovating. I was speaking to some colleagues, and we were talking about carbon credits, for example, and we were commenting that you can buy a carbon credit derivative in crypto and a derivative of that. So innovation isn't the problem, it's actually financing them. So what was the blue recovery bond? Now, in a moment, you're going to think I've completely lost it, so just hear me out. What we're suggesting is that you pay people not to do something. And the reason that I'm saying that is nature and biodiversity often needs to recover. It needs a period of regeneration. So there's a lot of ideas, I think, and very, very good ones on land, and we've heard of stuff. I'm worried I can't compete with rhinos and tequilas, but I'm going to go to the oceans. And I'm sure that many of you know that vast parts of the oceans are overfished. But there's really good news. The good news is there are repeated scientific studies that show if you actually leave it alone for a bit, it seems to recover remarkably quickly, somewhere in about a 3 to 5 year period. So what we thought is, how would you actually stop people from fishing and clearing the oceans out? Will you pay them to do it? So the idea of the Blue Recovery Bond was really simple. You tell or agree with a group of fisher folk that you're not going to fish, to which they turn around and say, well, you've just cut me off, I've got no income. So you release a bond and effectively you pay them not to fish for those 5 years. And that allows the seafood, etc., to regenerate. You then kick in and they can start fishing again, and actually they get an additional benefit. The additional benefit is it's cheaper because the effort they have to put into fishing, which is labor, which is energy costs, actually falls because the area has recovered. And as I say, there's repeated examples, very, very dramatic ones. I'll take one from South Africa, one of the oldest marine parks in South Africa. They protected it. 5 years later, the difference between the marine park species and that outside was 42 times greater within the marine park. These are very, very dramatic numbers. That is, I've taken a particularly significant one. If you take the Caribbean or Caribbean, whichever side of the Atlantic you're on, St. Lucia did the same, and they found that recovery was about rates of 42 to 90%. So, thinking of it on a fixed income basis, what's everyone worried about in the fixed income world? Default. Okay, I get that, but there's so many scientific studies showing that you should expect recovery. So that would be your risk, that the oceans wouldn't recover, that this one instant, it will suddenly be the reverse of what's happened elsewhere. Because if it does recover, as it recovers, they can fish more cheaply and therefore pay the coupon back. So I hope that makes sense to you.
John, thank you so much. I think it's another really great example of where there is a specific conservation need. There are real people involved, and to be able to create and innovate with, financial tools that are going to address not just a conservation need, but take people into consideration at the same time, and build that collective working to be able to have something that's really going to have impact across the board. Swaroop, I'm going to come to you, and HSBC is moving like a steam train in the environmental finance side, and it would be fantastic to hear about some of the innovation that's coming out of a financial institution.
Yeah, thank you. I hope I'm audible. So I don't have a very interesting story like stop fishing or tequilas, but I'm the more boring world of traditional banking. But there is one thing that I would like to leave with you. We are a global bank. So the peculiarity we see is the spectrum of clients we work with, from large corporates to mid-markets to SMEs. And I keep saying this, that the challenges that SMEs face are very different from what you see in the other set of the clients. And we are particularly focused on solving those. And what we are currently trying to do in our business called trade finance is to leverage the network of clients we have, which is across multinationals, large corporates, to support the SME clients we are banking, particularly in Asia and the supplier regions of the world. And a key tool that we have been developing, and this has been a journey that we have been on, is supply chain financing. Now, supply chain financing, for those of you who do not know, is a very simple solution where you leverage a large corporate buying from small suppliers, and the relationship of large corporate is leveraged to pay the small suppliers at a better interest rate than they would have otherwise afforded, because you are taking the credit risk of large buyer. What we have done is to extend the structure on sustainability parameters, and we have had the journey across ESG and also now extending it to nature, and I'll tell you in a moment how. So we started working with a client on their decarbonization journey on supply chains, and they created KPIs and parameters around reduction of greenhouse gases among suppliers. We worked with the company to develop this program, got third-party providers to sort of set KPIs, and now they work with SBTi, CDP, etc. And we are now working with them to implement greenhouse gas reduction program with the suppliers. So there is a behavior change that is brought in by incentivizing suppliers, by making finance accessible to them at a better price than they would have otherwise got. And the outcome achieved is reduction of greenhouse gases in supply chain. This program quickly extended from being a greenhouse gas reduction program to a social program when we added that dimension of diversity and inclusion into it. And so we have extended this from just E to S. And now this is a prominent retailer around the world which sources a lot of palm oil. And as you know, in palm oil space, certified palm oil is one of the ways of looking at sourcing palm oil and reducing the deforestation risk. So we are actually working with the client on increasing certified palm oil sourcing and going a step further now to incentivize suppliers to have regenerative practices in palm oil sourcing and incentivize those practices, again, using supply chain finance. So effectively, you're using the leverage that you have with large corporates, the credit capacity that you have with large corporates to finance the smaller suppliers. And the next stage of this, which is something that we foresee, is to really access capital markets like was spoken about earlier and go deeper into the supply chain from tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers, where we are looking at now tokenizing some of the risks that we have using digital technology to tokenize credit risk and transfer credit risk and finance deeper tiers of suppliers. So that will enable us to go further and finance the deeper tiers and the smallholders, which is really the problem in palm oil supply chain. So really using the traditional models, you don't have to do really something very exotic to do good. We have to leverage the traditional ways of banking and financing and other techniques with the right mindset to have targeted approaches to make behavior change happen in the value chain, and that's really going to bring change. I think that's the message I want to leave. There are several other structures that we are working on, even on the lending side, which I can speak about, but I wanted to leave this message that there is a large responsibility on us to support the SMEs around the world, because access to finance, access to resources, and capacity building is really the challenge in the SME level, and that's very, very different from what large corporates face.
Thank you so much, Swaroop. And I think, you know, we've gone from rhinos and protected areas, you know, to tequila, to fisheries and marine protected areas, to value chains. And it just shows what we are actually capable of achieving when we pull all the different skill sets together, start to look at what is that need and how do we begin to address it. There's been a considerable amount of discussion on value chains, and sometimes looking down the value chain and thinking we don't have enough data, we don't have enough control over that, and then to see HSBC step in and say what is our role in being able to bring green finance down that value chain, and particularly the role that it has for SMMEs. So we're going to jump across to Kazakhstan and talk about SAIGA and finance there. So Vera, it would be really great to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Welcome to...
She gets a cheer. You know, it's very nice. Somebody scored, man.
So my name is Vera, and I'm from the National Conservation Organization named ICBK. We are a BirdLife partner in Kazakhstan. And maybe some of you already heard that yesterday our joint initiative with the government of Kazakhstan was recognized as the one of the 10 first world restoration flagships. So we are very delighted to receive this award. And I think I want to use this example of this initiative to tell today, because one of the reasons why this initiative is successful, because this is the really long-term partnership. And I think this is the partnership is diverse, including government and including civil society, national and international organization. And because of this, that we find different solutions to finance our initiative, I think I can give you some examples. From the perspective of how we finance civil society actions, I think it's most important maybe to highlight importance of the core incomes. Like being the national civil society organization, the most core incomes come from our sister organization, which is Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Being together in the BirdLife family, we use this approach, a partner-to-partner cooperation. And also we have a long-term cooperation with the Sigrid Trausen Trust, which is UK-based foundation. And having this annually core incomes, we really help build ICBK is the very sustainable organization. And I have a few examples that it's definitely helped to develop the staff members, to build internally career for the people. It's also important to have this sustainable income to be flexible, working with the government when any change can come up. And also, it's also help us to be independent. It's obviously, and also avoiding to be donor-driven organization. So we really do have our own strategy that we follow very strictly, and also it helps us to increase success for the grants, because many donors, they're looking for the co-financing of the grants, and we can use this co-funding to showcase this. But this is very unusual organization like RSPB, Sigrid Trausen Trust, because there are so many little donors and organizations that really understand the value of the unrestricted incomes. And this is the question, why there are so little organizations understand it, and what we as a civil society organization can do differently to engage donors and investors to work openly on the trusted way, because there are so many directions like internal management system, communication, developing policy advocacy, and all these directions are not possible to develop without this unrestricted core incomes, and this is the crucial. So another example is from the financing government actions, and specifically it's the so the establishing protected areas is the very complex and expensive actions, and specifically it's the true story for Kazakhstan, where we have a really large territories, and the creation of the protected areas usually happen like between 340,000 hectares, 800,000 hectares. This is the scale that the government of Kazakhstan is working for. And in the past, it was funded specifically by the government. By the recently, UNDP, we support with the JEF project. They helping government to establish these protected areas. And most recently, we are adding value to existing approach where the WIS Foundation come in to invest the government of Kazakhstan through ICBK and RSPB to support establishing and to helping manage protected areas well. And I think if we can consider that there are more interests such as this philanthropic family can engage with the other government, I truly believe that more governments would be open to increase their protected areas. But this should be really on the long-term sustainable way. So then this is some examples specific, and maybe another examples would be in the context of also our initiative is the green bonds. It's linked to the government debt with biodiversity conditions are also, which emerging mechanism pioneered specifically by large with Nature Conservancy. And I think this approach, I believe it can be really useful in the case of the financing state protected areas. And what is mentioned already today is the diversification of the carbon financing is also may work, and specifically in the Kazakhstan, where we have a really large grassland ecosystem and the wetlands. And also maybe the last, but I cannot say it's really innovation, but I think it's a very unique example. ICBK, together with the Fauna and Flora International, has a long-term collaboration and the funding from US Fish and Wildlife. And this is very specific focus in funding on the illegal wildlife trading. So when we have an ongoing project 1, 2 years, to 2 and 3, focusing on the different stage of the combating illegal trade, like data analysis, smuggling routes, preparing the sniffer dogs and difference. So as a civil society organization, we have a very complex and demanding approach in how we should really be flexible. And I even didn't mention you how we work with corporate, how we do a lot of consultancy, how we develop commercial services like tourism and so on. And I think this is the only way that civil society can do now. And so some few examples from me today. And we are open to share with our experience.
Vera, thank you very much, and just a huge congratulations on the Restoration Award that you received, and what that means for grasslands and Saiga in Kazakhstan. And I just want to touch on a point that Vera raised in terms of trust between organizations, and how that's allowed for an increase in sustainable finance, and moving beyond your typical restricted and donor-based funding. We've had some conversations as sustainable and conservation finance experts about magic money that comes in where it's needed the most to catalyze that conservation action on the ground. And I think, building that trust between organizations is a really key point out of what Vera shared. So we're going to jump across to an incredible place in Africa, the Gola Forest. And I know that partners around the Gola Forest have been looking at new ideas and concepts for sustainable finance. So Michael, if you can share a little bit on that for us.
Thank you very much. I'm Michael Gawo, as she said, from Liberia, the BirdLife partner in Liberia, working for an organization called Society for the Conservation of Nature of Liberia. I think as we all move to sustainable financing in conservation, Liberia is no exception, and we work with our next country, Sierra Leone, to manage the Gola Forest as a transboundary initiative with the involvement of the two governments. But the work there as a civil society, as a project-driven institution, is to work with local communities. We mobilize them to play lead role in managing these areas and make decision makers to see what have happened. If you go about, Liberia holds the highest remaining forest in the Upper Guinea forest, with almost 42%. And the law of Liberia has said there should be 30% of the remaining forest in Liberia set aside for protected area. And that 30% of the Liberia forest is almost 1.5 million hectares. But we have not gone far with that 30% because it is procedure to establish protected area. You have to work with local communities, and you have to manage protected areas that will be established. And looking at those points, you have to bring in the livelihood opportunities to those communities so that they buy into the management of these protected areas. So I'm working with, as a BirdLife partner in Liberia, working with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, BirdLife. We are project-driven. Sometimes we get projects from the EU and USAID. But this come out to really support the communities and help establish these protected areas. With the effort on the ground, we have been able to establish Gola, which is 88,000 hectares. And now we are in route of establishing the Foya protected area, which is almost 98,000 hectares. This is our effort to the government, but you have to get the buy-in of the local communities. And the buy-in of the local communities, most projects that we get is short-term. By the time the project ends, everything comes to a stop. So before you start a new one, they will go back with illegal activities or something you have taught them before because they think they have to make their lives. But with project continuation, it have always helped to keep them on our light. So with the mobilization, with the engagement, I can see that communities are willing to form part of conservation parties. They are willing to form part of the protected area management. But you need a sustainable financing mechanisms to be able to keep them in that light. These have come about by RSPB helping to establish a red financing mechanism on the civil union side. And this have really helped with community buy-in in local communities, the paramount chiefs, communities, like 10 or 15 communities receive their annual benefits. And then they also help by patrolling their own community forest with funding that comes from the RED program and paying them with this. So we are seeing how this can jump over to the Liberian side, and then you can manage the entire transboundary Greater Gola landscape in the same context. So right now, we are working with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds that are working with other partners to come up with this RED program into Liberia so that we can have sustainable financing mechanisms. If you follow up, Liberia, they give concession area for 25 years. If we have a RED program in Liberia that goes for 25 years, I guess by the time before the 25-year end, there will be enough change of attitude, change of behavior, and people are able to buy into the conservation work and manage their own community forests. So we are moving to this. We hope it can go ahead, but in the main end, we are on the ground working with the local communities, making them to buy in, play a lead role in managing these areas. So we work with over 60 communities in those areas, and they have gone far, and SCN stayed there looking around. But RSPB, the BirdLife family, have always been there to get out there and find a bigger funding mechanism so that we can keep this running. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you so much. I think it's, I think it's a really great example of where we've traditionally relied in the past on the same types of funding and faced issues where projects come to an end, buy-in comes to an end, and the role of sustainable finance to slot into that so that you can see ongoing efforts take place and that those efforts really go to scale and have the impact that they're designed for. So it's going to be fascinating to see how the RED Plus project for Gola goes ahead, and particularly because it's going to directly benefit those 60 communities that you mentioned. So I'm going to be a little bit cheeky, and I'm going to go totally off script, and I'm going to ask our participants. I'm going to give you all the exact same question, and I'm going to ask you to stick to one critical point based on what you've shared. So we've had this plethora of examples of different types of finance mechanisms for different types of conservation needs involving different stakeholders and different sectors from all over the world. But every now and again, when it comes to seeing an innovative finance solution really hit the sweet spot, which means that there is a flow of finance to the point of impact where it's needed the most, there is a lever that needs to be pulled. There's some light switch that goes on, a connection point that makes it work. And I'd love to hear from our speakers what you feel that one lever is, that one light bulb moment that went on. So Ellison, I'm going to come back to you and the Rhino Bond. I say Rhino Bond, Wildlife Bond, that moment, all that time, all those role players, all those different elements, and all of a sudden it came together.
Wow, that's a tough one. But I would say the credit goes to our colleague who is a lawyer. And normally our lawyers are against everything and stop everything. But our friend Jorge, who is fantastic, the country lawyer for South Africa, he was able to help us cross a bridge, which was how do we apply all of our policies, procedures, or safeguards, etc., for managing investor money, because the investors are foregoing their coupons, and that's what's paying for the conservation work. And we have to use all of our policies, procedures, and skills to manage that. So he was able to introduce the grant agreement / transfer agreement, which allowed for combination of the systems that are already in place, but to be applied in a new way. And once the lawyer is on your side, really selling the idea that says, these are our typical instruments, this is our legal mandate, we can do it. So I have to say he deserves all the credit, and that was the one thing. So I don't normally like to give the credit to the lawyers, but in this case, Jorge and Sharmila and colleagues, they really did a brilliant job.
Thanks, Ellison. I love that it's an example of where you might have financiers at the table, you've got conservationists at the table, and then, bringing in that lawyer to just suddenly put that bridge in place that's going to take all of that effort and make it work. And I think it's a very concrete example of the enablers I spoke about at the beginning. We need all hands on deck if we're going to problem solve and create finance solutions that have the impact that we want to see. So, Sergio, your one magic moment.
Yes, we have to develop efficient financial mechanisms from the international to the local, because it's like a piñata. You try to put and crash the basin, but the candies never go down, and it's really difficult to put the money from the international support to the local people, and we need to give low interest rates to transform the productive system in land, because if not, it's really difficult to do the transformation of the reality in local aspects. Thank you.
I'm totally adopting the piñata expression from now on. It's going to become one of my analogies. I think sometimes we know that the money is there, like the sweets in the piñata, and it takes a couple of bashes, and everybody's kind of got to take a turn, and all of a sudden it's that magic moment where you smack it, and the finance flows to where it needs to, like the sweets coming out. So I love that. That's fabulous. John, your lever.
Yeah, well, I haven't got us off the ground yet, but Ellison gave me a personal guarantee that the World Bank is going to underwrite it, but maybe I was influenced by the tequila, who knows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what we found as a caution, and it was unintended bias. So what we did is we looked at the most nature-dependent countries in the world, which we define by exports, and we mapped that against their credit rating. If you were an OECD country, the more nature-dependent you came, actually the credit rating didn't move very much. So think of your Icelands and your New Zealands and things like that, and Greenland territories. They didn't move. If you were a non-OECD, you absolutely suffered. So the more nature dependent, and I'm mentioning it because of nature positive, etc. Do I believe that that's a deliberate bias? No, I don't. But we've sent it to all the credit rating agencies and said, can you just look at this? Is it an unintended consequence? So I'm afraid I'm on the negative. It's a caution.
But that's great. I think it's a really important caution, because in all of these processes, as you are putting your building blocks in place to start to create these new things, you want to be able to know what it is, what are your essential ingredients that are going to make a finance solution work, and what are your potential hurdles and your potential dead ends. And there are learning experiences and cautions that are going to come out of these processes that might help others to navigate around that, or as we create new finance solutions and replicate them, that we avoid that dead end and don't get lost in the maze. Swaroop, with the value chain work that's been happening, there must have been a sweet spot all of a sudden that HSBC discovered.
Yeah, I think if I was to name one ingredient here, and this has been spoken about in various sessions, is the whole thing about partnerships. And this is a perfect example of how you get interdisciplinary skills to work. We are bankers, we know financing well. In the structure that I explained around supply chain financing, there was first building trust with suppliers on this is actually a win-win for everybody. So we are not imposing the will of the large corporates on the smaller suppliers. That was the first step. And then bringing the right partners to develop more ambitious plans and really thinking holistically across ESG and now nature positive. It was the secret ingredient, and we are continuously working on this program. It's not ended. We have been very successful so far. We are extending it to new frontiers and to multiple clients. And I did speak about in another panel that these are not isolated examples. I think what we need is simple solutions which can be replicated. You can do very well in one or two pockets and areas where you have some isolated example of an innovation. But I think what will change the world or what will make an impact is to do something simple, easily understandable, and replicable. If you can replicate these things on industrial scale, that's when you create impact, and that's what we're seeing in our network. We started this program, which I spoke about 4 years back. This was the first in the industry at that time. We have now had multiples of such programs across our clients, and we have new clients asking us for more. Every time I speak, there are 2 new inquiries that come to me actually about this. So it's something that you have to replicate constantly. So yeah, partnerships is the one ingredient that I'll say was the magic.
I love that. I totally agree. When you look at all of these examples, it's never happened in isolation. It's not one organization, it's not one group taking on an activity. It's all of them together beginning to create those solutions. And like you said, solutions that are simple and can be replicated. So Vera, when we talk about grassroots and we look at all this amazing restoration work that's happened in Kazakhstan, what do you think was that catalytic moment, that fire that lit for the work that you've undertaken?
I think innovations really requires partners to trust each other, what I was already mentioned. And I think also confidence to fail and learn. So this is what we have to do together. And I think specifically for Altın Dağlar, because the scale is so large, and I think it's also to bring this essential element of the innovations, because this is makes possibilities to attract big investments as well.
Great, thank you so much. So Michael, I'm going to come to you lastly with Gola. And when you think about all the history that's happened in Gola and the work that's gone on with communities, this shift that's starting to take place around sustainable finance and seeing those activities have the endurance that they need, what was that key moment?
I think I would say motivation and leads to the buy-in. And once the motivation is there, the coordination comes, and the communities are willing to join the work, do it at all levels. So at that moment, you are able to talk to them, you are able to get them to buy in and do what you can, and you all can work together to conserve a particular area. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. I think realizing that the work that we need to undertake in conservation finance and the role of people, particularly people that are living in and around areas that they're reliant on, that it just simply cannot be ignored. We need to be able to pair those two things up. They are two sides of the same coin if we're really going to see a lasting change happen. So our panel have been really incredible, and we're going to pivot a little bit now. I'm going to hand over to Patricia from UNDP. It is Finance Day, and there are some really exciting things that have been announced at this COP. There are more exciting developments on the go, and we want to showcase some of those. And I think, you know, continuing the ethos of innovation and the story of hope of what we actually are able to achieve with finance solutions for nature. So, Patricia, I'm going to hand over to you, and then we're going to welcome up 3 more panelists. Thanks, Patricia.
Thanks, Candice. Can everyone... Is on? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Candace, and thanks very much because you've been a great partner in pulling this together, also with Planet Tracker. So very much appreciate that, and to the panelists. Before I just want to reflect a bit on what I've heard, but I'm gonna start with Sergio. How much more for the sustainable tequila?
How much?
How much more?
How much more?
Yeah, what's the premium? Is there a premium?
Well,
Price premium.
The price. Well, no, it's sorry.
Yeah.
It's not the most interesting is not a higher price.
Okay.
Is tequila is expanding his demand in the world, and the mechanisms don't generate cost to the producers. And the objective that the industry is to maintain in the market, and they are have a commitment to be a production not only in deforestation but best practice for biodiversity and other aspects like carbon neutrality and everything. I think is the most important that I think is the private sector and the industry can change to give us best products to consume and don't generate degradation and deforestation. I don't.
No, thank you. Look, the reason I ask is because I think a common thread that I've picked up here, and it's something that that we at UNDP and all of you think about has been mentioned on this panel is what does that transition look like, right? And what are the sort of types of incentives, whether it's for communities, for the farmers in the supply chain, for sustainable palm, or moving to these practices. At some point, along the way, there are people, right, that's what we've been talking about, that are at the center of, these innovations that need that kind of support. So the end product is, something that's certifiably, as you're saying, sustainable. And that brings in other, questions around how we do that, how we actually ensure the integrity of those certifications, the traceability, and all of that. But I think this concentration on that I've heard here on the layering and the sequencing of the finance and the incentives that are needed to protect people and empower them and give them the agency to be on this journey and come out the other end, with a more competitive environment and better livelihoods is really what's at stake here. And we did hear it a couple of times. And it's sort of what a new thing we're working on at UNDP, and I work on across the nature, climate, and energy team for the United Nations Development Program for UNDP. So we're operational in about 140 countries, working closely with all of my partners on this panel, of course. And we're thinking about how we actually create some sort of a facility, a mechanism around nature that targets those ecosystems, those species that are most at risk. Candace and I were just talking about this before the panel, and all the great tools that IUCN has. So we're going to be working, I think, very closely together on this new initiative and identifying, what those sites are. But how do you address that risk is by looking at the underlying drivers of that risk. And ultimately, when we're talking about landscapes and ecosystem, we're talking about the agricultural, practices, right, and communities that rely, on that transition zone, right. And palm is definitely one in an area like the Loiser and North Aceh in Indonesia, right. So, so this is the focus of that effort, attacking those drivers of degradation, those risks. But ultimately, how you then bring in large ticket investment to do actual transformation at a scale that is, sustainable, right? So I think we've all demonstrated here today brilliantly that there is no lack, as you say, of innovation. There is no lack of actual finance. There is no lack of actors. There's no lack of partnerships, right? We are all here. It's about how we actually put those together, in a sequence. It's not all logical, of course, but in a sequence that actually maximizes that outcome and allows us to get to scale. I mean, we know more than anyone because we have over 1,000 projects across these 140 countries. World Bank knows this. We have many, many projects, right? Not coming together necessarily in an aggregate impact. And it's the impact that we need to be after. That high-level impact, that high-value impact, that high-value transformation. So this is what we're aiming towards with this new facility is, sort of a kind of a modular approach, if you will, that brings in, sort of the best practices that are already happening, financing that's already being deployed, instruments like bonds that are already being deployed, new instruments like biocredits, and probably we can have another discussion about that later. And seeing how we can actually layer these solutions to target large-scale transformative impacts on the ground. But it has to happen at that community level, right? And I really enjoyed that, that emphasis, because if the people are not empowered, if you don't have that buy-in, if you don't have that agency, forget it, it's not going to work, or certainly not going to be sustainable. And I think, just on the, to close, we're hearing, and as we know from everyone who's, following the negotiations, one of the points is on disclosure, right? And whether and mandatory, and of course there's the Business for Nature has been I think bringing together a lot of businesses, HSBC being one, but there are many others that are calling for mandatory disclosure, some coherence, to the expectations of government and to regulation, and that makes that makes a lot of sense from that perspective. But that's just the start, right? We started with the task force on climate, right? Now we have also the task force on nature. We're going to hear about more about that this evening. Next is the task force on social. My colleague Marcos Neto, I don't know if any of you were in the earlier plenary today, but that's coming. We're looking at that now. So those indicators, for corporates, right, and for investors, where they're already there, they are going to become more prevalent, more out in the front. So the ESG and the nature, all of this will come together, I think, and it's not just necessarily about if it's mandatory or not. It's already how you start planning for that, how you start embedding that in your practices, in your processes, in your investments, in your strategies, and how that comes to life, in practice. And that's really what this nature facility is, one mechanism that UNDP is, trying to create to enable that kind of experience and knowledge to flourish and be applied, but also being mindful that the regulatory environment is shifting. So I'll stop there, and thank you so much again for having us here. Thanks to all my fellow panelists as well.
Thanks, Patricia. It's great to hear about this new nature facility that's coming. So we're going to invite up some panelists to share perspectives as well from a little bit more on the private sector. Patricia, do you want to call up? We've got 3 new friends. I'm going to grab an extra chair while if you don't mind calling them up.
Very good support for us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Candace. Thanks to all our panelists. So if I can please welcome our next panels, Naomi Morazzoni, the Senior Vice President of Philanthropy from Salesforce. Marina Severansky. That's not what she told me earlier, and I already forgot it. I'm sorry. I'm chewing a candy, so I did forget. The Head of Sustainability for North America for Schroders. And Gautier Kirou from the Managing Director of Natural Capital for Mirova, please. And do we have Naomi here? Oh, there she is. Hey, Naomi. Okay, great.
I did try and bring up some of the comfy chairs, but I see you've all found a perch on our wooden benches. So, but thank you so much for joining us on this panel discussion. So we've been talking about innovative finance, and we've been talking about how we ensure that the finance solutions that we develop really go to point of impact. And I think there's some unique perspectives from you as panelists. So Namu, we're going to start with you, and particularly around the role of philanthropy and how catalytic it can be in starting to move some of these innovative finance solutions. It will be fantastic to hear some of your perspectives.
Yeah, so thank you. So at Salesforce, we really see that the climate and nature crises are interconnected, and that if we're going to solve for one, we have to solve both, right? We have to address both of them. And through that, we're actually, in our own climate financing strategy across our company, we're thinking about different levers that can be used. And I represent the philanthropic angle of that. So last year at COP, we launched a $100 million ecosystem restoration and climate justice fund. And the goal of this is really, when we look across the climate financing tools that we have, thinking about the early stage catalytic, risk-tolerant interventions that can be used to de-risk, to crowd in other investors, to build capacity. One of the things I'm hearing constantly in these conversations at COP is that, you know, we need to create the enabling conditions, we need to build that local capacity, the local skills, the knowledge to make that happen. And so we've done a couple different things, and I'll just give a couple brief examples to explain that. One of the big things that we're looking at is doing the pre-development work. Okay, so this is, we call it the unsexy work of the work, right? Like this is the permitting, the stakeholder mapping and engagement, the question of, is this even going to be feasible? Doing the feasibility studies to say, can we do restoration here? Is this going to work? And then being able to, and we don't know, right? That nothing could happen out of that, but we need to do that work, and that takes time, and that takes people, and that takes money, right? And so we need to invest in that. The other things we're doing then is looking at scale. So in places where, yes, feasibility has happened, and we know it can work, we're supporting the project, but we're also supporting things like doing baseline blue carbon assessment to say, okay, yes, now that we know this can be done, how might we attract additional financing into that? And then sort of our last step in that is thinking about, okay, how do we then use our platform, our voice, our convening power to crowd in other investors and other supporters? And so we think about initiatives like the Mangrove Breakthrough, where we're trying to unlock $4 billion in public and private and philanthropic funding to protect the futures of 15 million mangroves around the world, right? And so it's all of these different interventions done, you know, with precision, with flexibility, in a nimble and fast manner to try to unlock some of these opportunities.
It's really incredible to hear about the volume of work that's happening and how many landscapes, how many different areas it can potentially touch. And when we had our panelists up here, you know, speaking about innovation on species and ecosystems and all manner of things, I asked them the question of what that magic moment was, what that critical ingredient is. And you spoke about the boring bits, all the pre-development that has to go into it, you know, the different partners that need to come in. What do you think that moment was for this fund?
I mean, I think we're in the evolution of that for us right now, right? So we are a year in, and we're still in a learning phase. I think what we're constantly trying to do is push ourselves to listen, frankly, to our partners, listen to whether that's the amazing organizations like TNC and CI and those folks to tell us, where do you need us to go? How do we need to be involved? And I think it's also continuing to try new things. So we just launched a Salesforce Accelerator for Nature, and this is a pilot where we said, okay, let's bring unrestricted funding, let's bring our technology platform, and let's bring our technologists, our engineers, and our developers, and have a nonprofit say to us, hey, I have an idea, I don't know if it's gonna work, will you help us? And that's what we're doing. So we just announced our first cohort of that. Again, I have no idea where this is going to go, but the potential is so amazing. We're talking about bioacoustics and remote sensing, and then some of the more mundane work of, you know, program management, so then that nonprofit can attract additional funding. So it's a constant iteration, and for us, it's really a journey. So I don't know if there's a moment. It's many moments that are coming together for us around a broader strategy.
And I think that constant iteration and the willingness to take a little bit of risk, to leap off the edge, to leap into the deep end and see what might happen, it, for me, is a magic moment that Salesforce would be willing to do that and engage with partners who would want to do that with them. And we heard from so many of the previous panelists that one of the issues that they've struggled with is when you're looking at sustainable finance and not having a project or a conservation intervention come to an end, there does need to be a little bit of iteration and a little bit of risk taking. So it's fantastic to hear about that pilot. And I'm hoping that we're going to see more of that across the world, more partnerships where we're willing to say, we're not quite sure exactly, but we're going to take the leap together. So, Gautier, there's been some very exciting developments from Mirova, and it would be really great to hear about this new exciting fund that's just been launched.
Sure, yeah, thank you for the invitation. Indeed, Mirova is a fund management company based in Paris, but with offices around the world, and we are trying to be innovative to launch new projects. And actually, we've been active in the field of financing nature for almost 10 years now, and we are managing more than $700 million for really nature-based solution, natural capital, with funds including one launched with the UN Convention to Combat Desertification called the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund that could attract private capital from institutional investors through blended finance vehicle to finance sustainable land use at scale. And so that was a first achievement, and we are proud indeed to have announced yesterday during the business forum a new initiative that is called the Climate Fund for Nature, that has been initiated by Kering, the luxury fashion company in France, and joined by L'Occitane Group, the beauty company. And what is interesting is that it's a fund that has already a significant scale. The two of them are bringing $140 million or euros now. So the fund is created. It will start operation in January. So it's not just a communication. It's real action. And we are aiming to have up to 300 million euros of capital. And also the innovative approach of the fund is that it's focused on nature-based solutions. And it's good that it's innovative, but there are more and more activities towards these types of activities. So it's about mangrove protection, restoration, land restoration, and also accompany the smallholder farmers in their transition to regenerative agriculture. It's patient, long-term capital. It is risk tolerance. It is catalytic. What are the buzzword? It is non-speculative and transformational. Now, I mean, it's a 20-year fund that leaves sufficient time for projects on the ground to emerge, develop, and the objective is really to help new projects be developed, implemented, to finance NGOs, cooperatives, local projects. And I think it's really striking to see the commitment from corporates. And we found a new way of working with corporates. Last year we had a fund with Orange, and now with multi-corporate fund, it's really powerful commitment aligned with net zero today. So it's also the climate funding is coming to nature at scale, and I think it's really an important momentum. And we hear a lot these days about biodiversity certificates with nature positive, associated with nature positive commitment. While on the one hand we try to leverage a lot of institutional finance from pension funds, insurance companies with blended finance on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a lot of capital from corporates that is a really interesting contribution to the funding of nature protection and restoration, and we are very grateful to Kering and L'Occitane to have chosen Mirova, and happy also to collaborate. It's a call to action. All the partners, project developers, come to us, and hopefully at COP16 we will showcase a great portfolio with nice videos in the Nature Positive Pavilion.
It's fantastic to hear about this fund and such an exciting move. And I think something that you shared there about that is the willingness that this requires. So yes, there were lots of buzzwords, but to make something like this actually happen and tangible and to begin operating from next year does require an enormous amount of willingness. And that's a put your money where your mouth is commitment, which is fantastic. But I just want to ask you a follow-up question in looking at that magic moment, that sweet point, to actually get to the point where the fund became a reality. It's obviously got 20 years worth of impact coming down the line, but there was obviously a lot of work in the background to get to this point. And if there was a key moment in that development that you can share.
Well, I think that's the creation of this fund is the result of a journey of each of the partners, where either Caring, L'Occitane, or Mirova in a different sector have integrated nature in their strategy, have developed tools to better understand the relationship between their business and nature and how they could support, nature protection, restoration, and well, there are coalitions and forums where we could actually meet Caring, L'Occitane, and others, and namely it's One Planet Business for Biodiversity, OP2B, as we are three of us members of this group. And I think probably it's one OP2B meeting that has also facilitated this alignment of vision coming from different backgrounds but converging. And also, I really believe that these types of coalitions are very useful to align partners and create common denominators to build together, ambitious initiative. But yeah, and there are a lot going on with these types of public, private, civil society coalition, and they work well.
So that's something that really resonates with me, chairing two types of coalitions like that. And I think being able to cross-pollinate means you have to have an environment where that starts to happen, and really percolating together and having those discussions, building those relationships. So that for me really is a magic moment, that you can have collective engagement and it starts to result in some exciting developments. Marina, we're going to come to you, and I know you've got some great perspectives to share with us. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Any particular question or just sort of a dealer's choice?
Yeah, if you can just give us an overview of some of the work that Schroders is driving in this space.
Thank you. So Schroders is a large UK asset manager. We have nearly $1 trillion under management, and we sort of sit around the world. We come here as fiduciaries. We are always fiduciaries. I mean, being here for the last few days in Canada, among folks who care very deeply about these topics, it feels like I'm a world away from what I normally do. I'm the head of sustainability for North America. But North America, as you know, there's a big country south of here where there's been a lot of backlash against kind of folks investing in any sort of ESG or sustainability to include, nature. And so we've had to kind of remind critics, right, that we're not an NGO, we're an investor, and that we do come from the perspective of fiduciary obligation. But it is very clear manifestly to us as investors that nature risk is becoming integral to investment risk. And so as fiduciaries, we have to understand the kind of impacts, the dependencies that our investments have. So although there are, some examples of sort of specific nature investments that we're making that are very exciting and sexy, the reality is that we can have a lot of impact across the wider part of our business, the kind of nearly $1 trillion of just regular invested assets across sort of diversified investments, where, for example, we've made a commitment to remove any sort of commodity-related deforestation in our portfolios by 2025. This requires, obviously, engagement with our investee companies. We've undertaken 200 engagements so far this year towards that end. We published an engagement blueprint, so companies will know what we expect, and one of the 6 key themes in the blueprint is around natural capital and biodiversity. And so the kind of nature positive impact that we can have as a large investor who has influence, right, can bring that influence to bear, Again, spans both sort of directed natural capital investments. And we, for example, have partnered with Conservation International and have created a group called Acaria in Singapore to invest in regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, and also conservation, protect and restore projects. And we're excited to continue to do things like that in other parts of the world. I'm excited to hopefully see something like that in North America. But like I said, it's sort of in combination with what we do across all of our business, where we've sort of defined, nature as, first of all, there's real risk, right, in the portfolios, but then also a tremendous opportunity. It's almost sort of a new asset class for clients. We can sort of, go to, again, a client who hasn't specifically said to us, I want to do this or that, nature. We can explain, again, as an investment case, that right now there is a tremendous gulf between the sort of social value of ecosystem services and their market value. And so on one hand, yes, risk, to businesses that are dependent on dwindling natural capital resources, they're going to come under pressure. But on the other hand, right, there's the kind of opportunities that are emerging because you can capture that growing demand for nature positive impacts, the least of which, I suppose, on the carbon offset side. Right? So if nature could actually be valued properly with respect to how it can help actually in the climate challenge, I think you have tremendous opportunity there for clients. And so we've been thinking about how to, again, kind of create that really just investment case for clients and say, you're looking for differentiated sources of return. We're in a new kind of market environment with inflation that's sort of persistent. There's all these sorts of things that are happening now. Here are areas that can be really interesting in a diversified portfolio.
So I want to pick up on something you said there, Marina, around the role that you have as an influencer. And also I think it's critically important to realize that regardless of the type of organization, the type of entity that you are, you have to work within certain parameters. So with fiduciary interests, there is so much that you can do in the innovation space, but you're going to hit certain boundaries and certain frameworks within that. And I think what's really, really important to highlight there is within that space that Schroders is looking at as an influencer, but within your fiduciary responsibilities, what does that innovation space look like for you?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think it all comes down to we are always working at the behest of the client, and there are various sorts of clients, right? And so we sort of talk about fiduciary duty. You have kind of pension folks, and then, of course, you have endowments and foundations that are more mission-driven. You have private wealth. I mean, these are all sort of different components, and Schroders has a very diversified business. And so I think about it always as sort of a, kind of a bifurcated piece, right? On one hand, there's just kind of what can we do to be better investors? And that's understanding fully the kind of risks that are manifest in the portfolios and helping to mitigate those risks. And so, again, nature falls very squarely into that for us. And then on the other hand, there's sort of the client says to us, and we are increasingly hearing from clients, that they want their money to be working towards certain goals. And then it's really incumbent on us to find those opportunities for them, to create those opportunities. So we've partnered, for example, with Natural Capital Research, because if we don't understand the value of something or kind of how to measure it, then we can't productize, right? We can't create the product around it. So that's kind of the first piece. We talked about influence. I mean, you said influencer. Just thinking about Schroders as an influencer, like on Instagram. But I think just, like I said, kind of bringing influence to bear as a large investor, not alone. Obviously, we're working in partnerships with other peers like us. As I said, I think that just comes down to the kind of engagement work that we do around all the topics, whether it's sort of climate, whether we talk about just transition on the climate side, and here kind of natural capital and biodiversity. I think in the creation of, again, of sort of new product, it's just very important, frankly, to align the kind of objective of the product, the risk parameters, right, the potential returns, all those sorts of things with the client. And just to ensure that people are getting what they ask for. It's very clear that we as an industry are acting on behalf of our asset owners, that we're partnering with them and we're thinking about them. We have a whole kind of impact arm at Schroders, which also does, some investing in the natural capital space. And again, very, very clear that we're partnering with asset owners who are articulating to us a preference to focus on whether it's natural capital, whether it's, human capital, whatever that category is, just our ability, our reach, right, to be able to sort of find those investments, create strategies that people can put their money into. So I think it's really across the board. That kind of innovation is driven really by our clients and what we hear from them. And because we increasingly hear about, an interest in this, and we're obviously here seeing it, it just gives us a lot more scope, to do that work.
Thank you so much. It's really great. So I want to offer an opportunity to anyone in the audience that might have any questions for our three speakers. There's some exciting funds that have just been launched, and it would be great to hear from the audience if there are any particular questions that you want to ask about these. We do have a ton of mics floating around everywhere, so please just put your hand up if you have a question, particularly with regards to any of these new funds. Do I see any?
I'll start with a question.
Yeah. Okay, go.
And then I'll go pick on some people to ask questions. No, thanks to our panelists. It's great. I definitely want to come back to what you were saying about this new asset class, because this is, super fascinating. But just to take a step back, because this work that you're all doing is the work that you're doing, right? It's not necessary to bring it here, right, to Montreal, to COP15. It can be amplified and publicized in other ways, and I'm sure you have other fora. So my question is, why here, and what does COP15 success look like for each of you?
You all want me to go first? Okay. So I think, so this is my first COP. So, I have not been at lots of these. So I am here with colleagues who have. And one of the things that I have heard, which I think is really exciting, is this is the first time that business has shown up in this really robust way. In fact, on my first day here, there was a briefing in the morning for business, and it was, people were out the door, and I was trying to wedge my way in to listen. And the dynamics and the energy is different in this space. And I actually come from an old CSR consulting background, way back in the day when carbon markets were like, what is this really fringe idea? And so then to come into a space where there's so many panels that are on financing, and I was on a panel yesterday on the World Bank, and they were talking about bonds, and they paused and said, how many people know what a bond is, right? And like a quarter of the room raised their hand. And so we're in this moment where there's so much excitement, and we're building an industry, and we're building in a whole different way of financing the work that has to get done for our people and our planet. At the same time that we have these knowledge gaps, we have language gaps, we have conversations where we're not all speaking from the same set of terms and level of understanding. And so what I get excited about from philanthropy is, how do we better coordinate? How do we better make it so we're all talking from that same set of information, that we all have the same goals, right? This is all about trying to protect our people and our planet. And we need to do it in a better way that's coordinated. And so a moment like COP, where we are coming together and having these dialogues and having these conversations, to me is just incredibly exciting.
Yeah, it's a great COP so far. Now, what I can tell on my side is that I've attended several COPs. Actually, the first one was the Climate COP in Montreal in 2005, so I'm glad to come back here. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that today there are so many delegates from the private sector attending. I think everyone noticed that. And what is also very pleasantly surprising is that there is real expertise and knowledge and know-how about biodiversity. When we initiated this natural capital activity at Mirova, it was like 7 years ago. I did attend a few conferences, and I was sometimes the only representative of the private sector or from the finance sector. And then there were groups that were created, but with just a few institutions really discussing biodiversity indicators, metrics, and so on. And just in a few year times, now there are so many institutions that, they know more than us, and it's great, and there is great expertise. And this creates a real momentum, which means that bringing energy, initiative, willingness sends a clear signal, of course, for the negotiators to raise the ambition. But whatever, the global biodiversity framework outcome is, this momentum is here to stay. And I think the world has changed, and there are key change agents in all categories of public, private, civil society organization, and coalition of the willings is also what can change our economy, our world. And that's why COP15, especially in person, is better at some point, can just catalyze more ambition.
Incredibly well said, thank you. What I would say is, so we're here under the auspices of Finance for Biodiversity, and there are a lot of businesses here. I certainly see a lot of the corporate side. I think, the investors, right, the financing, we're starting to come out in numbers too, but there should be more. I think, part of, for us, obviously we came to lend our voice to having a strong, global biodiversity framework, to accelerate sort of the pace of financial flows, right, in support of these efforts. Greenwashing has been a big issue, again, like down south, in terms of the industry. And so I think from an investor's perspective, we're very strong advocates. We signed up for the Make It Mandatory campaign, and we're very strong advocates of disclosure. Look, I mean, again, as investors, we're not going to wait for mandated disclosure. We have to understand the companies we invest in, so we're going to ask them to explain themselves to us, even if there isn't something formal. But it certainly helps when there's mandatory disclosure. So I think there's sort of that component of it, is just wanting to be here to kind of speak to that. We were talking, I think, at lunch, because we have to reflect to our firm about kind of what we saw here, is that there are kind of two conferences happening at the same time under one roof. One of which is the sort of formal negotiations, which I won't comment. I mean, you guys have been watching too, right? And the other is, like, here we are, right? We've got the folks who've been participating all along and who are very passionate, and then you've got the businesses, and you've got the kind of finance component. And we can create momentum here, again, regardless of sort of what happens on the other side. And so that's really exciting. I mean, the other thing is, again, we're investors. We smell opportunity, right? We're here, and I would say specifically with sort of COP15, although we have, attendees at the other COPs as well, but we wanted to kind of come out in sort of large numbers. Right now, again, I'm just talking about, like, as an investor, there's a gap. There's an inefficiency that can be exploited, so in a positive way. There's the value that's placed on nature and its services and the benefits that it provides is tiny, right, relative to its real value. So we don't have enough incentive to act, like relative to the actions that we need to see. And I talked a little bit about kind of the new asset class perspective. Again, if we can really accord the value to nature that it actually has, as kind of ecosystem services, the kind of, the underpinnings of global GDP. And then from a climate perspective, right now, only 3% of global climate finance goes towards natural climate solutions. But that can provide 30% of the climate action needed to sort of deal with, frankly, climate change and take us on the right pathway around carbon. So there are these exploitable inefficiencies. It's very clear that this is a more nascent space, and so it's really exciting to kind of bring capital towards that and, again, be innovative around it. So I think that was one of the reasons that we wanted to have a bigger presence, at this particular event.
So I think, from our previous panel, there were a lot of examples around how much innovation there is globally that's happening in different parts of the world, and specifically targeted at different conservation solutions for species, for protected areas, for livelihoods, down value chains, and by a wealth of different actors. And I think, what the three of you have shared now, we've crossed a Rubicon, I feel. There is a point in time at COP, and as well, the negotiations go on, and, there are some people with, their hopes are a little bit dashed around what's happening with negotiations, but I think the hope that we can take out of the examples that have been shared today is that the realm of innovation is really limitless. We've got an enormous horizon around innovative financial solutions that can be targeted at a range of different nature-based interventions. And then we've got participation from countless different sectors, different skill sets, different stakeholders coming together. And it's what I said from the very, very beginning of this panel, is that we have these two critical enablers that are going to allow us to really really address the finance-nature integration. And the one is all hands on deck. So when we see how many different business entities and experts are at this COP, it's just vastly different to what we faced before. And we need every sector, every skill set, every different stakeholder on board if we're going to have any chance of addressing the scale of the issue. So that, for me, is a really big takeaway from this COP. We really have crossed the Rubicon from that perspective. And then the other enabler is that we have to have a toolbox that is full of a range of diversified finance solutions. We can't have one single approach to financing nature. There is no one finance solution that's going to address the problem. I often say in our context that there's no such thing as a green finance solution. It's going to take different asset classes, different types of funds. It's going to take bonds and debt finance instruments. It's going to take fiscal instruments like tax incentives and a multitude of others if we're going to start to address finance for nature at scale and really plug that substantial finance gap that we're seeing. But I'm left with real encouragement from what you've shared, from taking risk, from building willing partnerships and the launch of the new fund, to looking at, how do we challenge clients and how do we create new asset classes. It's been fantastic to hear those perspectives. We have questions. Can we grab a mic?
Question, I deal with a lot of institutional investors as well. I think it's more of a trend. Do you see institutional investors currently looking at ESG or green investment or whatever you might want to call it as an option, or are they putting this ahead of return? Because we haven't seen a shift yet from the return angle, and this comes as an add-on. Or do you think that will happen, where investors are willing to compromise return if it is ESG or otherwise?
Yeah. If you want my honest answer, I don't think anybody wants to compromise.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I said, we have a large arm under Schroeder's under the umbrella called Blue Orchard, which is our impact. You know, one of the most experienced impact investors in the world, so 20 plus years in emerging markets. And we talk about it like anywhere else, that you are looking to have a market return. You're looking to have a good return. But then there are these other things you're trying to achieve, and tremendous opportunities that you could unlock. For example, there's a financial inclusion component there, right? Kind of in emerging markets, financing women's initiatives. Things that pay tremendous dividends, right, for society. But I think it's we don't start, like, our front foot is not, hey, just give up a little and here's what we can do. It's very much, I don't think it's an add-on. I think part of it is sort of bake it together, right? To say we're looking for great returns, and part of that is making sure that you mitigate risk and you make those returns more durable, more robust, right, by kind of understanding those risks. Part of it is being on the lookout for opportunity, right? And so, look, I think, with due respect, right, philanthropy is critically important, and we show our clients kind of it's a mapping, right, that goes from ESG integration, which is the most sort of financially oriented, right? It's just looking at risk and opportunities, all the way to philanthropy. And nothing wrong right there. You absolutely need philanthropic money. But the kind of spectrum in the middle where we operate around kind of maybe, sustainable investing, impact investing, I think has to, the word investing is always in there, has to kind of predicate on that at least market level of return. And then can you do better than that, right? Can you find those opportunities to, those inefficiencies, right? To create something even better for clients. And I think that that ranges across. So you would think like, oh, okay, of course the public pension, they can't give anything up. But maybe if you're talking to an endowment or a foundation or a family office, but underneath, nobody wants to give up returns. So I think the onus is on us, again, to kind of make sure that the risk management and the opportunity, the active management, the sort of, security selection and project selection, that all of those things are feeding into, frankly, better. It doesn't have to be better returns every moment, right? You have a time horizon too, and you say that, like, what is the investor's time horizon? But over time, you should be delivering a market return or better alongside that sort of sustainability objective.
I think it goes back, and I don't want to extend the argument, but I think it goes back to the point of how we value return. I think that the concept of value has to be relooked at if this has to scale. And if we continuously look at value as returns as mathematical return, then it's not going to work. I think.
But you can't be short-term greedy, I guess is my point, right?
Yeah.
You say like be longer-term greedy. You know, it's you know, there's an investment horizon. So if we take a shortcut now and you build in risk that shouldn't be there, it'll come back to bite. So it's better to, you know, have that long-term perspective around risk and opportunity. So I think it's just about how you educate and how you align what you're doing with the clients, again, risk tolerance and their time horizon.
Swaroop, thank you so much for that question. I see we had another hand there. Thanks.
Okay, just a short question. I'm curious to hear what is the panel's view on biodiversity credits? Is that something to invest in?
Yeah, yes. I mean, so we actually had a conversation this morning. I mean, I think it's early, right, or kind of an early stage, but this is one of the things we're talking about in terms of sort of new asset classes, new opportunities. I think obviously quality is really important, so just a lot of vetting, a lot of due diligence that's required, but I think certainly one of the many, you know, potential kind of innovations that can be interesting and over time can be part of an institutional portfolio.
Before you answer, Gautier, if you ask a question, would you mind introducing yourself before you do? But thanks.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, we tend to speak also about biodiversity certificates to not to imply that there is at some points or some offsets, or it's about providing a value to any activity that contributes to protection and restoration of nature. I think there's definitely an interest there as a principle, just to give a price for good activities and more revenue. But like for the carbon market, we need to ensure supply side integrity, so that one certificate really corresponds to genuine, action, additionality, and not to oversimplify biodiversity, even if we need to find also a common denominator. And also, obviously, demand-side integrity. What would be the use for this certificate? Is it for a clear and transparent pathway for a nature-positive, commitment from a company, or just to continue and overexploit nature in other places? So the good thing is that there has been so much work on carbon, especially on the integrity, council and all these acronyms with ICVCM and others, that we should definitely leverage on this work and accelerate, like in many other topics, for more biodiversity. Yes, certificates markets to emerge, but we are pretty supportive of this market.
So I'll just add that I think this is one of the places where there's a consensus, and when there are divergent views, where I think philanthropy does have a role to come in to help with some of the conversation, and again, that kind of background work that happens, and thinking about some of those principles that are rooted in equity and rooted in the ensuring we're supporting our communities through this. And so I'll just give a quick example that we supported with Conservation International and a couple other organizations, was the high quality blue carbon principles and framework, to really ensure that as blue carbon is being developed and these opportunities are there, that we're making sure that they're delivering the positive outcomes for people, for nature, for climate as part of that, right? And so it's a multi-stakeholder initiative and collaboration to bring that level of consensus. And frankly, it's a V1, right? That we shared at COP27, but thinking about, okay, how do we, in a conversation that is complex, how do we do that process that is inclusive and collaborative?
Those are really great points. You also had a question. Thank you.
Hi, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Neelam Patil. I come here representing the children of California. I am Time Magazine Innovative Teacher of this year. I'm an elementary school teacher. And I want to just say a few things. First of all, I think it's so important that I'm also a small business owner, so I understand business really well. It's so important that the business community is showing up, because as a school teacher, I have children who are crying for the planet. I have 6-year-olds who tell me that I'm crying. And we were able to do some really exponential healing of nature in our school because of a private donation from Allbirds company in San Francisco. And what they got out of it was brand recognition. So I think that is something that's I also attended the subnational summit, and I noticed that there's a lot of cities who really want to have more biodiversity in their city, but they're moving so slowly. And business needs to spur them, and that's how we actually got our school district. If I had been sitting here trying to get public funding for my project, I'd still be sitting here. However, with the carrot of private financing and donations, we were able to create some really incredible growth within our school. And so I just wanted to say, as a case study, and just to build on what Naomi was sharing, we had to bring together all the stakeholders, and it really does take everybody and every skill set. And my question is, of course, it's for myself. We actually implemented something really incredible. It's called the Miyawaki method. I don't know if people have heard about it. It's a forest method that's very scientific. It's not just for children. It's actually to rewild an entire city. What suggestions do you all have for someone like me who can, I just don't feel like we have a lot of time. We need to act quickly. And to bring this, because it is actually very scalable, it's very easy to do in any locality. It's easy to do locally and make a global difference. What suggestions do you have for someone like me who's a humble school teacher to scale this globally? Because I could easily just go and try to take some business class, but I just don't feel like we have the time. So I'm looking for support and mentorship.
Thank you so much for sharing and for your contribution to youth. And it's fantastic to have so many different voices in our audience and part of this discussion. And I think, you know, everybody's got their skill sets and their roles to play, you know, to not necessarily become the business leader and the finance, but to obviously stick to what you're essentially really good at. But maybe from the philanthropy side, there are some key nuggets that you could share there.
Yeah, so we spoke earlier, so, you know, again, thank you for what you're doing, and I think engaging the youth and making sure, you know, that they have the tools and the knowledge and the language. You know, one of our most effective tools that we have is around mobilizing our voices and mobilizing, you know, our communities together, engaging our local government. So I'm so glad to hear that you went to that session. You know, I think it does, I think the other thing where I take hope, or I recognize, is that it's going to take all of these solutions, right? There isn't a single solution to solve all of them, and there are phenomenal organizations that are working in urban forestry. American Forest is a great one that does tree equity, and when we can, it's something I hear actually a lot in the developing, you know, regions is, you know, trying to scale one by one by one by one is not going to get us where we need to. But when you bring the coalition of the organizations that might have slightly different methodologies, but bring them together and can do that at scale, that's when we start to see that action and that energy happen. And so connecting with the people in your community who are also doing that, who are having the conversations, who are talking to the public officials who have the funding to unlock in the other foundations, right? So it's not you trying to solve on your own, right? It's the coalition of the willing and the able who are coming together who make that change.
I don't know that I have specific advice, but that was really great, Naomi. And I think that what I would say, though, is kind of from our perspective, as we think about future, we have the Sakarya business, which is in Singapore. As we look to kind of grow around the world, you would be a very short-sighted investor indeed if you didn't make sure that the kind of local community and the people were fully sort of bought into what you do. Again, short-term greedy versus, you know, right, long-term support. And so there's absolutely a component of sort of, you know, profits going back into the community, you know, again, building durability. And so I think my advice would be, like, to feel confident, right? Because the people who want to make the investments do want your insight. Like, we want to hear from the local partners. Like, so we think about the people, the communities, that kind of the human face of all of this, right? Of kind of natural capital, biodiversity, climate change, all of these things. It's become manifestly clear, I think, COP27, as well as here, that we just need to talk about people a lot more and the impacts on people and the kids in your class, right? And so that's the thing, like, you will find willing partners, because all of us who are thinking about these projects are already coming with that mindset that if we don't engage fully, with local stakeholders, with the people and the communities, then it just won't succeed in the long term. And so hopefully it just gives you a confidence boost, right? The people coming your way, they're looking to work with you. Certainly we are, and I think any other organization like ours that is sort of, really approaching this in a, like a durable way is going to feel the same way.
So we have reached the end of our time. Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions, but I'd like to thank Naomi Gautier and Marina and Patricia from UNDP for your insights today and for sharing the exciting things. And I, for one, believe that this is just the start. I think there are going to be increasing opportunities, increasing innovations, and as we continue to have the discussion and continue to collaborate and cross-pollinate our different sectors, our different skill sets, we're going to see that finance for nature gap slowly starting to close and the impact where it needs to be, regardless of whether it's biodiversity in our cities or huge landscapes in Kazakhstan and everywhere else that we've been today in our panels. So we've had an incredible array of panelists, also to those that were up on stage earlier from the various different parts of the world. Our deepest thanks for all the work that you do and the innovations that you shared. So I hope you enjoy the last remnants of Finance Day and leave inspired with what we're able to achieve going forward. Thanks.